What would you do if you suspected your own family of the unthinkable? When Oliver's mother died suddenly, he knew something wasn't right, but nothing could prepare him for the horrifying truth he uncovered when he dug up her grave. This is a story of betrayal, justice, and a son's relentless pursuit of the truth. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the cemetery, its light filtering through the trees and painting long shadows across the rows of headstones. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. Oliver stood at the edge of his mother's grave, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The funeral had been just 3 days ago, but it felt like a lifetime. The memory of it played over and over in his mind. The hurried service, the closed casket, the way his father, Douglas, had avoided his eyes the entire time. Rose Russell had been the heart of their family. Kind, vibrant, and full of life. Her sudden death from a supposed heart attack had left everyone in shock. But Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His mother had been healthy, active, and only 52 years old. She didn't just die. She was taken from him. And the way his father had acted since her death only deepened his suspicions. Douglas had been cold, distant, almost relieved. He hadn't shed a single tear at the funeral, and now he was already moving on, as if Rose's life had meant nothing. Oliver's eyes drifted to the fresh mound of dirt in front of him. The soil was still loose, easy to dig. He glanced around the cemetery, making sure no one was watching. The place was deserted, save for the distant chirping of birds. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. He had to know the truth. He grabbed the shovel he had brought with him and drove it into the ground. The sharp thud of metal hitting dirt echoed in the silence. With each scoop, his muscles burned, but he didn't stop. Sweat dripped down his face, mixing with the tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. He didn't care if the whole town thought he was crazy. He didn't care about the consequences. All he cared about was finding out what really happened to his mother. As he dug deeper, the memories of Rose flooded his mind. Her warm smile, her laughter, the way she always knew how to make him feel better, no matter how bad things got. She had been his rock, his guiding light. And now she was gone, buried beneath 6 feet of dirt, her life reduced to a headstone and a few faded memories. The shovel hit something solid. Oliver froze, his breath catching in his throat. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the dirt with his hands. The wooden coffin came into view, its surface smooth and unblemished. For a moment, he hesitated, staring at the box that held the woman who had raised him, loved him, and protected him. But then he remembered her words, the ones she had always told him when he was unsure. "Trust your instincts, Oliver. They'll never lead you astray." With trembling hands, he pried open the coffin lid. The hinges creaked, the sound echoing in the empty cemetery. And then he saw her. Rose lay there, pale and still, just as she had at the funeral. But something was different. Her hands were clenched into fists, her nails broken and bloodied. Her lips were parted, as if she had been trying to scream. And then Oliver noticed the faint scratches on the inside of the coffin lid. His blood ran cold. His mother hadn't died of a heart attack. She had been buried alive. Oliver stumbled back, his legs giving way as he collapsed onto the damp grass. His chest heaved, and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just discovered. His mother, his kind, loving mother, had been conscious when they buried her. She had fought, clawed at the coffin, trying to escape. But no one had heard her. No one had saved her. Tears streamed down his face as he crawled back to the coffin, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her cold, lifeless hand. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." But even in his grief, a fire began to burn inside him. This wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone had done this to her. Someone had made sure she was buried before her time. And Oliver was determined to find out who. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the police. The operator's calm voice on the other end felt surreal compared to the chaos in his mind. "I need to report a crime," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "My mother, She was buried alive. I'm at the cemetery now. Please, you need to come. As he waited for the police to arrive, Oliver's mind raced. Who could have done this? His father? The thought made his stomach turn. Douglas had been distant since Rose's death, but could he really be capable of something so monstrous? And what about the doctors who had declared her dead? Were they involved, or had they simply been fooled? The sound of sirens in the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. He stood up, wiping his tears and steeling himself for what was to come. The police would ask questions he didn't have answers to yet. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Someone had taken his mother from him, and he wouldn't rest until he found out who. The flashing lights of the police cars cut through the morning calm, their red and blue beams reflecting off the headstones like ghostly apparitions. Oliver stood a few feet away from the open grave, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes were fixed on the coffin, now fully exposed to the pale sunlight. The forensic team had arrived, their white suits a stark contrast to the dark earth surrounding them. They moved with precision, documenting every detail. The scratches on the coffin lid, the bloodied nails, the faint bruises on Rose's wrists. Detective Brown, a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, approached Oliver. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone was calm and probing. "You're the one who called?" she asked, her gaze flickering between Oliver and the grave. Oliver nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, my mother. She was buried alive. I found her like this." Detective Brown glanced at the coffin, her expression hardening. She motioned for the forensic team to continue their work, then turned back to Oliver. "This is a serious accusation. Can you tell me why you decided to dig up the grave?" Oliver took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "She didn't just die. Something was wrong. The funeral was rushed, and my father, he's been acting strange ever since. I had to know the truth." The detective nodded, jotting down notes in a small notebook. "And your father, where is he now?" "At home, I think," Oliver replied. "He doesn't know I'm here." Detective Brown studied him for a moment, then signaled to one of her officers. "Bring the father in for questioning, and get the medical examiner here ASAP. We need to confirm what happened." As the officers dispersed, Oliver felt a surge of anxiety. His father would be furious when he found out what Oliver had done. But he didn't care, not anymore. Not after what he had discovered. The forensic team worked meticulously, carefully examining Rose's body. And their report confirmed Oliver's worst fears. She struggled inside the coffin. When the medical examiner arrived, he confirmed what Oliver already knew. Rose had been alive when she was buried. Detective Brown returned to Oliver, her expression grim. "This is a homicide investigation now. We'll need to speak to your father and anyone else who was involved in your mother's death. Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to harm her?" Oliver hesitated. His father had always been a difficult man, but he had never shown any signs of violence. Still, there was something about the way he had acted after Rose's death, something cold and calculating. And then there was Scarlett, his father's mistress. Oliver had always suspected she was more than just a family friend. Could she have been involved? "I don't know," Oliver admitted. "But my father, he wasn't exactly grieving when she died. And there's a woman, Scarlett. She's been around a lot lately. I don't trust her." Detective Brown nodded, making a note in her notebook. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. This is going to be a long process, Oliver. Are you ready for that?" Oliver looked back at the coffin, his heart heavy but his resolve unshaken. "I'm ready. I just want the truth." The police station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Oliver sat in a small interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly together. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, but it did little to calm his nerves. Detective Brown sat across from him, her sharp eyes studying him as she flipped through her notes. "Tell me more about your father," she said, her tone calm but probing. "You mentioned he's been acting strange since your mother's death. Can you elaborate?" Oliver took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. He's always been distant, but after Mom died, it was like he didn't care. And then there's Scarlett. She's been around a lot more since Mom passed. I think they're involved. Detective Brown raised an eyebrow. Involved? Romantically? Oliver nodded, his jaw tightening. Yes, I've seen them together. They're not exactly hiding it. And Mom knew about it too. She told me once that she suspected something was going on, but she never confronted him. She didn't want to cause trouble. The detective scribbled something in her notebook. Do you think your father could have had a motive to harm your mother? Oliver hesitated. The idea of his father being capable of something so monstrous was hard to accept, but the evidence was staring him in the face. I don't know. He's not a violent person, but he's always been controlling. And he stood to gain a lot from her death. She had a life insurance policy, and the house is in her name. If she died, he'd get everything. Detective Brown leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. That's a strong motive. We'll need to look into his financial records and see if there's any evidence of planning. What about Scarlett? Do you think she could have been involved? Oliver shrugged, frustration bubbling up inside him. I don't know. She's always been nice to me, but there's something about her that feels off. She's too perfect, you know? Like she's always putting on an act. Before Detective Brown could respond, there was a knock on the door. An officer stepped in, his face grim. We've brought the father in for questioning. He's in the next room. Oliver's heart sank. He wasn't ready to face his father, not like this. But he knew he didn't have a choice. This was about his mother, and he owed it to her to see this through. The interrogation room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. Douglas Russell sat across from Detective Brown, his posture relaxed, almost bored. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Oliver watched through the one-way mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen his father like this, calm, collected, and utterly devoid of emotion. Detective Brown began the questioning, her tone steady but firm. Mr. Russell, your son has raised some serious concerns about your wife's death. He believes she may have been buried alive. Can you explain that? Douglas's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered for a moment, just long enough for Detective Brown to notice. That's ridiculous, he said, his voice cold. Rose died of a heart attack. The doctors confirmed it. Detective Brown leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Then why did your son find evidence that suggests otherwise? Scratches on the coffin lid, bloodied nails, signs of a struggle. These aren't things we can ignore. Douglas's jaw tightened, and a crack appeared in his calm facade. I don't know what he's talking about. Oliver's been unstable ever since his mother died. He's looking for someone to blame. Detective Brown studied him for a moment, then slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of Rose's life insurance policy, with Douglas listed as the sole beneficiary. Care to explain this? Douglas's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. You think you're clever, don't you? Fine, I'll tell you the truth. But you're not going to like it. Detective Brown's expression remained neutral, but her voice grew sharper. We're listening. Start talking. Douglas crossed his arms, his expression smug. Rose was a burden. Always so perfect, so kind, so selfless. He spat the word like it was an insult. She was holding me back. I had big plans, and she was in the way. Oliver's stomach twisted as he listened to his father's words. They were like knives, cutting deeper with every sentence. He wanted to burst into the room, to scream at him, to demand answers. But he stayed silent, his fists clenched at his sides. Detective Brown kept her composure, though her voice grew colder. So you decided to kill her? Douglas laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Kill her? No, I didn't have to. She did that herself. She had a weak heart just like her mother. All I had to do was speed things along. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. His father had drugged his mother, put her in a coma, and then buried her alive. The realization was like a punch to the gut. He felt sick, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. Detective Brown, however, remained focused. "What do you mean, speed things along?" Douglas shrugged, as if discussing the weather. "I gave her something to help her sleep. A little too much, maybe. She went into a coma, and the doctors assumed she was dead. It was easy, really. No one suspected a thing." Oliver's mind raced. His father had planned this. He had calculated every move, every detail. And Scarlett, she had been part of it too. The woman he had always thought of as a family friend had helped his father kill his mother. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Detective Brown leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You do realize that this is a confession, right? You've just admitted to conspiring to murder your wife." Douglas's smirk faltered for the first time. "I didn't murder her. She was already dying. I just helped things along." "That's still murder," Detective Brown said coldly. She stood up, signaling to the officers outside the room. "Douglas Russell, you're under arrest for the murder of Rose Russell. You have the right to remain silent." As the officers cuffed Douglas and led him out of the room, Oliver finally stepped forward. His father's eyes met his. They stared at each other for a moment, with a visible weight of many emotions in their expressions. "You're no son of mine," Douglas spat as he was led away. Oliver didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, grief, betrayal. But amidst the chaos, there was one clear thought. His mother had been avenged. Detective Brown approached him, her expression softening. "We need to bring Scarlett in for questioning too. But this is a strong case, Oliver. Your father won't get away with this." Oliver nodded, though he felt numb. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The police moved quickly. Within hours of Douglas's confession, they arrived at Scarlett's apartment. She opened the door, her perfectly styled hair and polished demeanor faltering as she saw the officers standing there. Her eyes darted to Oliver, who stood a few steps behind them, his face pale but determined. "Scarlett Smith," Detective Brown said, her tone firm. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." Scarlett's composure shattered. "What? This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything." Oliver stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You helped him. You gave him the drugs. You knew what he was going to do to my mother." Scarlett's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. Then her expression hardened, and she sneered. "Your mother was weak. She didn't deserve him. Douglas and we were meant to be together. She was in the way." Oliver's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're a monster, both of you." As the officers cuffed Scarlett and led her away, Detective Brown turned to Oliver. "We'll need you to testify in court. This case is strong, but your testimony will make it airtight." Oliver nodded, though the thought of facing his father and Scarlett in court made his stomach churn. "I'll do whatever it takes." The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Oliver sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the polished wooden benches and the somber faces of the jury. Douglas and Scarlett sat at the defendant's table, their expressions unreadable. Douglas's smug demeanor had faded, replaced by a cold, detached stare. Scarlett, on the other hand, looked nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The trial had been swift and brutal. The evidence on Rose's body and in the coffin, pointed out by the coroners, was clear indicative, even more so after Douglas' confession and the life insurance documents. But the most damning evidence had come from Scarlett herself. Detective Brown took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted the details of the investigation. Douglas Russell confessed to drugging his wife, Rose, and burying her alive. He admitted that he wanted her out of the way so he could start a new life with Scarlett Smith. Scarlett, a nurse, provided him with the drugs used to induce Rose's coma. The prosecutor turned to Scarlett, who was now visibly shaking. "Ms. Smith, did you provide Douglas Russell with the drugs used to harm Rose Russell?" Scarlett hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. For a moment it seemed like she might deny it. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Yes," she whispered. "I did." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but the judge quickly silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel. Oliver felt a surge of anger and relief. Finally, the truth was out in the open. But the pain of betrayal still burned deep inside him. The prosecutor continued, his tone relentless. "And did you know that Rose Russell was still alive when she was buried?" Scarlett's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Yes, I knew." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. Oliver clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make them understand the pain they had caused. But he stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his father. Douglas, however, remained calm. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, his expression cold and unrepentant. The jury listened as his own words sealed his fate. He had seen Rose as an obstacle and ensured she never stood in his way again. Oliver's stomach twisted as he listened to his father's words. They were like knives, cutting deeper with every sentence. He wanted to burst out of his seat, to scream at him, to demand answers. But he stayed silent, his fists clenched at his sides. The prosecutor's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Russell, you drugged your wife, put her in a coma, and buried her alive. That is murder, no matter how you try to justify it." When asked to explain himself in court, Douglas showed no remorse, simply repeating what he had admitted in interrogation. He had helped things along. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a few hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The foreman stood up, his voice steady as he read the verdict. "We find the defendants, Douglas Russell and Scarlett Smith, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder." The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs, but Oliver felt a strange sense of calm. It was over. Finally, it was over. As the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Oliver felt a surge of emotions. Relief, anger, grief, and a strange sense of closure. His mother's killers had been brought to justice, but nothing could bring her back. After the trial, Oliver returned to the cemetery. He stood before his mother's grave, the headstone now bearing a fresh bouquet of flowers. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the grass. Oliver knelt by the headstone, whispering his promise to make her proud. A soft breeze brushed against his face, carrying the scent of her favorite perfume. He wasn't alone. He never would be. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, as Oliver stood alone in the cemetery. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. Rose's grave stood before him, the headstone now adorned with a fresh bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on Oliver's chest. He knelt down, running his fingers over the engraved letters of his mother's name. "It's done, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're gone. They can't hurt anyone else." The memories of the trial flashed through his mind. Douglas's cold, unrepentant confession, Scarlett's tearful admission, the jury's swift verdict. Life in prison without parole. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like victory. Felt like closure, bitter and incomplete. Rose was still gone, and nothing could bring her back. Oliver's thoughts drifted to the last conversation he had with his mother, just days before her death. They had been sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea, and Rose had smiled at him in that way she always did, warm, reassuring, full of love. "No matter what happens, Oliver," she had said, "always trust your instincts, and never let anyone make you doubt your worth." Those words had carried him through the darkest moments of the past few months. They had given him the strength to dig up her grave, to face his father, to stand in that courtroom and demand justice. But now, standing at her grave, he felt the full weight of her absence. The world felt emptier without her light. A gentle breeze brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of her favorite perfume, a soft, floral fragrance that had always reminded him of her. For a moment, he felt her presence, warm and comforting, as if she were standing right beside him. He closed his eyes, letting the feeling wash over him. "I miss you, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "Every single day. But I'll make you proud. I promise." He stood up, wiping the tears from his face. The sun had almost disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky awash with deep purples and blues. Oliver took a deep breath, feeling the weight on his shoulders lift just a little. The road ahead would be long, and the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. But he knew he wasn't alone. His mother's love would always be with him, guiding him, protecting him. As he turned to leave the cemetery, he noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath the bouquet of lilies. Frowning, he picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, soft, flowing, unmistakably roses. "Oliver, my dear son, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you this in person. But I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been so strong and kind, so full of love. Never let the darkness of this world take that away from you. Trust your instincts, my love. And remember, no matter where I am, I'll always be with you. With all my heart, Mom." Oliver's hands trembled as he read the note, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know when or how she had written it, but it felt like a final gift, a reminder that her love would never leave him. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket, close to his heart. As he walked away from the cemetery, the last rays of sunlight fading behind him, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world was still dark, still full of challenges and pain, but he knew he could face it. He had faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. And as he stepped into the twilight, he whispered one last promise to the wind. "I'll make you proud, Mom. I'll live the life you always wanted for me." The breeze carried his words away, and for a moment, he could have sworn he heard her voice, soft and gentle, echoing in the distance. "I know you will, my love. I know you will." What would you do if you discovered such a dark truth? What do you think of Douglas and Scarlett's actions? Could Oliver have done anything differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, be sure to subscribe to embrace the journey. See you in the next video.